First graders, and he was trying to engage his subjects with questions like, what are you going to be when you grow up? And one little girl said, tired. And a lot of us have grown up to do just that. We've grown up to be tired. And that's what's been great about the Thanksgiving holidays for most of us, I would say. We got a chance to get away from work, get away from the usual routine, be with family, hopefully, and rest a little bit, recuperate from the usual everyday life activities. It's good to see so many of you back, and I'm sure we have many others that are still on the road. But these Thanksgiving holidays have made me think about rest and how important rest is as a Christian principle. And so we're going to be talking about that this morning. It's amazing how many of us neglect rest and neglect to understand its importance, how valuable it is, and how productive we are with it, and how little we can accomplish if we don't have rest in our lives. A friend of mine in college got a new car, and I remember he drove it for several months, and then one day he saw me in the student center and he said, can I get a ride? And I said, what do you need a ride for? You've got a car. And he said, well, the engine burned up on it. And I said, how did that happen? It's a fairly new car, right? And he said, well, the mechanic said there wasn't any oil in it. I said, have you changed the oil? He said, nobody told me to change the oil in the car. They just gave me a car. I didn't know you're supposed to do that. And the look on his face is like the look that I see on faces sometimes when I say, when's the last time that you got any rest? You know, we're guilty of not putting oil in our cars, so to speak, when we don't rest and recuperate. It's just like burning up the engine on your vehicle. And we need to understand this principle, learn it, and apply it in our lives, even if we have to go to great effort to do it. And our text comes from kind of an unusual place this morning, the end of Isaiah chapter 28 that Steve read for us just a moment ago. That last portion of chapter 28 in Isaiah is a parable, and it's a parable based on agriculture, and it's placed within God's urging Hezekiah, king of Judah, and the rest of his people not to form an alliance with Egypt against Assyria and the enemies of Israel. So it's in the midst of all of this political advice that God is giving His people. He's telling them to make an alliance with the pagan idol worshipers of Egypt would be a fool's errand, because Egypt is unreliable and they will not help you out. But Judah's leaders were corrupt and they were drunkards. If you're looking earlier in Isaiah 28 verse 7, he says, of the rulers, they reel with wine and stagger with strong drink. The priest and the prophet reel with strong drink. They're swallowed by wine. They stagger with strong drink. They reel in vision. They stumble in giving judgment. So they weren't listening to the wisdom of God, and instead relied upon their own ideas. Among them was to make an alliance with Egypt. And he calls this in verse 15, a covenant with death. They were not making good decisions, and it was going to lead, according to verse 22, to their own destruction. And so Isaiah was going to Hezekiah and the rulers of Judah, begging them not to make this decision against the wisdom of God, because to follow after the wisdom of God is going to lead you into better places than to follow after your own wisdom, which brings us to the parable at the end of Isaiah 28. Farmers, they understand that to have good crops, you've got to heed the wisdom of God. You're not going to beat nature. So you work in nature's confines to get the harvest that you'd like to expect. And he gives two examples basically. One being that a farmer doesn't continually plow his crops. But after a while, he stops plowing so that he can plant and so that he can give the land rest, so that it can yield its fruit. And the other example is of threshing grain. A farmer doesn't continually thresh the grain because he'll destroy it There's a time to stop threshing grain so that the good part can be separated from the chaff and be made into bread for food. And this parable is there to illustrate to the leaders of Judah the great need to follow the wisdom of God instead of their own wisdom. The one who works in God's wisdom will find success. Farmers learned that a long time ago, the successful ones anyway. They learned that if they wanted to have good crops, they would have to follow God's wisdom, work within the confines of nature. Israel's leaders, if they wouldn't do that, they would never get out of the trouble they were in. Now, let's look at this for another application. It's all about God's wisdom, and it has to do with this political situation, but it's also talking about rest, because one of the illustrations he gives of the principles farmers follow has to do with rest. For one thing, he doesn't plow his crops continually. Look again at Isaiah 28, verse 24. Does he who plows for sowing plow continually? Does he continually open and harrow his ground? When he's leveled its surface, does he not scatter dill, sow cumin, and put in wheat in rows and barley in its proper place, and emmer as the border? And so, no, the farmer doesn't continually plow. He stops. He rests from plowing so that he can do other creative activity. And then in verse 28, he goes back to that again. Does one crush grain for bread? No, he does not thresh it forever. When he drives his cartwheel over it with his horses, he does not crush it. You thresh it, but to a point. And then you stop threshing so you can do something else. And that's how you get recuperative, building, flourishing activity in the world. Nobody succeeds in continuing to do the same thing over and over and over again without rest. That's the wisdom of God in this parable, illustrating the need of Israel to listen and heed to God's wisdom. It's also an application for us, because rest is a biblical principle that we need to hear as well. Rest is an essential part of a fulfilling and productive life that is pleasing to God. And we do a lot of damage by ignoring this wisdom. And think about a lot of the industrial accidents that have happened over the years. The Exxon Valdez oil spill, for example, or 3 Mile Island, or Chernobyl. All of those happen in the middle of the night, which suggests that part of the problem, a big part of the problem, may have had to do with getting very little rest. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was blown up, NASA officials had made the ill-fated decision to go ahead with the launch after working 20 hours in a row. And it is said that they got no more than 3 to 4 hours of sleep the night prior. And that accident that was so horrible and took the lives of 7 astronauts could have stopped the U.S. space program, and it all had to do with getting little rest, not getting enough rest. And we have example after example. In 2016, a bus slammed into a big rig that was stopped in L.A., killed the driver and 12 other passengers, and it was found out that the driver in the last 35 hours had slept only 4 hours. You don't get rest, bad things happen. And these are just big industrial examples, bus accidents, space shuttle accidents, but on an everyday level, we know this to be true. For example, we make too many commitments to the point that we become unreliable because we have to begin breaking promises. We get anger and frustration in our lives because we can't possibly keep up with all the things that we have on our schedule. And we start driving the people closest to us away because we're snapping at them. We're always stretched too thin. There's a lot of anxiety in our lives as we realize we can't possibly keep up. And there's no joy. And poor work is a result. Ironically, the harder you work, the less you are able to accomplish when you don't get enough rest. And so we see it on an everyday level. we see it in the big picture. We know this practically to be true, that if you don't get enough rest, bad things happen. And the Bible teaches us that rest is an important part of life. The Savior got rest even though He was omniscient God, omnipotent God. Jesus took time to rest. And I want to show a couple of examples from Mark chapter 1 and Mark chapter 6. So start in Mark chapter 1, and we see Jesus preaching in Galilee. And notice verse 35. Rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, He departed and went out to a desolate place, and there He prayed. And Simon, those who were with Him, searched for Him, and they found Him and said to Him, "Everyone is looking for you." And He said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for." And He went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. It's very interesting to me where this begins, with Him out in a desolate place praying alone. Some people might say, that's no way to preach the gospel. You got to be with the people. You got to be amidst the people in order to preach the gospel to the people. But prayer in desolate places was an important part of Jesus' process, and without it, I doubt he would have been able to do as much as He was able to do. Because you see, His batteries kind of get recharged, and after He's up in that place praying, and Peter says, let's keep hitting it right here where we are, Jesus says, I need to go to another place. He kept His focus, and He continued to go throughout, reaching more and more people. Look over at Mark chapter 6, and He's teaching this to His disciples. In verse 31, He says, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." There were just times where Jesus made them stop working, withdrew away from the crowds to a desolate place so they could eat, so they could rest, so they could pray. It was part of His process. And if the omnipotent God recognizes the need for rest, I think we should also. But we don't. So often we're tempted to ignore God's principle of rest. Why is that? I can think of several reasons why we neglect rest. Here's the first one. Some of us have been taught that hard work is the solution to every problem out there. You know, if I run into an obstacle, I just keep working harder and harder, and I'll beat my way through it. That's the way a lot of us think. And, we would do well to step back from that and reconsider. Maybe you've heard the legend of John Henry. John Henry, he beat the steam drill by working harder, but what happens at the end of the John Henry story? He dies. I heard about this epidemiologist that named a syndrome after John Henry, and it had to do with people who thought that anything could be conquered by just working harder. And he said these are the people that, when completing questionnaires, answer yes to statements like, when things don't go the way I want, it just makes me work harder. Or they answer yes to, once I make up my mind to do something, I will not stop until I complete it. And they feel that they're principled people in having those ideas, but they may not be accomplishing as much as they could if they took some rest from time to time. Here's another problem. Sometimes we get caught in a rut of meaningless toil. We just become so busy, we don't give ourselves time to think about how we might escape it, and we just feel trapped. And we're in a cycle. It's been described before as a hamster on a wheel. Maybe you've felt that way before. Solomon sure did. When Solomon gave his life to the pursuit of toil and tried to find value in labor, he saw that it was vanity and meaningless. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. He says, "What is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is of vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity." And so sometimes we just get in a rut. Another thing is sometimes we confuse rest with laziness. And we know that laziness is wrong. And so rest, if in our mind rest is laziness, then rest is wrong. But laziness and rest are two different things. Laziness is an irresponsibility. Laziness is not valuing activity that is productive and good for you. But rest is an activity that is productive and good for you. So it's different from laziness. Laziness is a sin, but rest is not the same thing as laziness. Sometimes we forget that we're humans and we put unrealistic expectations upon ourselves. We don't accept our limitations. We make our goals way too big. When we don't meet them, we beat ourselves up for it, and the cycle continues and continues. And then one last thing I have to mention is we have become controlled by these little electronic devices that we hold in our pockets or in our hands that we're constantly looking at. We give them control over our lives. Why do we do that? We think we can't turn the phone on silent and turn it upside down so we can't see it to complete a work or to have a meal with a family or to just enjoy some family time. Or we feel like we got to respond to every email. And what happens is people never get away from their work, or they just feel overwhelmed by trying to respond to all of the things vying for their attention constantly. It just can't be done. There's no rest. There's no change in activity. There are a lot of other reasons as well, but these are just some of the temptations that cause us to neglect rest in our lives. And we need to realize that rest is a biblical principle. It was modeled by the Lord Jesus, and it leads to more productive work and a more valued life in this world. But there's more than that. The principle of rest is important for helping us do more in life and helping us fulfill the will of God. It's important for that. But even more so, it's important because rest forecasts our ultimate life with God in heaven. And so the most important reason why you should rest is because when you do it, and you do it properly, you're giving this world a glimpse, a foretaste of eternal life with God in heaven one day. It's a way of acting out heaven while you're on earth. And there are a lot of other ways to do it, but rest is one of them. Heaven is called a place of rest. Now, the Bible speaks of 4 different kinds of rest, and I'd like to outline them for you real quickly as we think about this. First of all, there's God's rest on the 7th day of creation. His creative activity lasted 6 days, and on the 7th day, He rested from His creative labor. Now, that doesn't mean He stopped doing things. If that's true, the whole universe would fall apart every Saturday. That's not what happens. But on the 7th day, God rested. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. That means He stopped creating things, and on the 7th day, He began sustaining things, upholding things, holding them all together, just as Christ is described in Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. So that's the first kind of rest, the rest we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. Secondly, you have the Sabbath day, which is commanded in the 10 Commandments. You also see it in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. The Sabbath day was the 7th day of the week, a reminder of the Israelites' liberation from Egyptian bondage. It was a commemoration of an event. They were no longer slaves in Egypt. They needed to pause on a day for worship, to think about with gratitude what God had done for them. And so the Sabbath day is a familiar command of rest. And then you have the Promised Land, in Deuteronomy 12 is described as a rest. It's a rest from sleepless nights in the wilderness, a rest from running from invaders and raiders and enemy armies. The Promised Land was a rest from dreaming about settlement because you were settled. It was a place free from the oppression and turmoil they once knew as Egyptian slaves. And then there's one last rest, which is rest with God in heaven. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I want you to turn over to Hebrews chapter 4 and look how this rest is described. And the first thing I want to point out is it's described as both being here now and also described as something that we're still waiting on. First of all, in verse 3 of Hebrews chapter 4, the writer says, we who have believed enter that rest. And he's speaking in the present tense. So he's saying, we who have believed continue to enter the rest with God in eternity. And so there's one sense in which when you become a Christian, you begin that rest. But obviously we haven't fully, ultimately entered that rest. I mean, there are all kinds of evidences of that around us. We're plagued with temptation and trials and hardship and turmoil, and life is still toilsome and full of drudgery. So we're not there yet, and that's emphasized in this chapter as well. If you start back at verse 1, where the writer says, while the promise of entering His rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. And so it still stands. It hasn't quite got there yet. And then in verse 6 he says, it remains for some to enter it. And in verse 9 he says, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And then finally in verse 11 he says, therefore let us strive to enter the rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. So 4 times he says we're not there yet, whereas in verse 3 he said we have continued entering it. What does it mean? Well, it's like all of the promises of heaven. We begin to enjoy them now, knowing that they haven't fully been consummated. Ultimately, one day Christ will return and usher us into that rest once and forevermore. But we're not there yet. And that's the 4th kind of rest, and the most important one to all of us, the one that we're looking for as we live today. This, by the way, this rest, this 4th rest, is the Christian Sabbath. And people get the Sabbath wrong. They still attach the Sabbath significance to a particular day of the week. And they'll say things like, well, the Jews' Sabbath was on Saturday and the Christian Sabbath is on Sunday. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the Sabbath day ordinance, along with a lot of other things in Judaism, was meant to foreshadow the reality of heaven with God in eternity after Jesus returns. The Sabbath day ordinance was a part of the Old Covenant. And God made the Old Covenant only with Moses and with the Israelites. Look at the end of Exodus chapter 34. And He says, I've made a covenant with you, Moses, and with Israel. The rest of us, that was not a covenant for us today. It was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and we have a new covenant mediated on better promises. So after the old covenant was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, Christians began worshiping on the first day of the week. You see that example in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. You see them doing that in John chapter 20, the day of the Lord's resurrection. You see them doing that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. They're worshiping on the first day of the week, and the reason is obvious. They're doing it because that's the day on which Jesus rose from the dead. And our faith hinges on that resurrection. That is so important to us, and every Sunday we come to worship to commemorate that wonderful event that happened after the death of Jesus Christ. In fact, the last mention of the Sabbath day is in Colossians chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, where in context Paul is saying that the old law, including the Sabbath day ordinance, was nailed to the cross. And so when you have Sabbath rest in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, it's not talking about a day. In fact, the word that is used there for Sabbath rest, this is the only place it's used in the whole Bible. And it's used here to refer to a state of being more so than a particular date on a calendar. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. He's talking about heaven. He's talking about eternal life with God. And so all of those objects in the old law, including the Sabbath day ordinance, pointed to spiritual realities. And the Sabbath day is just one of those. Now this rest in heaven is important. Heaven is a rest. Look at Hebrews chapter 14, verse 13. I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. But what does that mean? They may rest from their labors. Does it mean there's no activity in heaven? Are we going to start confusing rest with laziness again? Is it just lying around on puffy clouds, playing harps, and just whiling away the eternity while we do that? That's not at all what heaven is described as. In fact, whenever you look at the Bible and you read about heaven, you see that heaven is a place full of activity. And never is rest in the Bible described as just laziness or doing nothing. When God ceased all His creative activity after the 6 days of creation, He continued to work because He had to hold the universe together. He had to keep the rains falling and the sun shining and the crops growing and gravity working. All that stuff continues because after the 6th day, God changed His activity to something different. Jesus astounded the crowds on one Sabbath day when He said, my Father is working and I work. John chapter 5, verse 17. What did He mean? He's talking about the sustaining activity of God versus the creative activity of God. When He rested, He continued activity. It was just a different activity than creation. The Israelites didn't stop all of their activity when they entered into the Promised Land. But when they entered into the Promised Land, it was time to build houses. It was time to plow crops. It was time to work the fields. There was a lot of work for them to do, but they weren't invading, they weren't conquering, they weren't warring, they weren't wandering. They were doing different kind of work. The Sabbath day was not a cessation of all activity because the Israelites would worship on that day. They would gather together with family and friends. They would eat together. They would do necessary daily tasks. It just was a different kind of activity than what they did the other 6 days of the week. And heaven also is not going to be a place of no activity, but it's going to be a place of some very different activity than what we have to endure here on earth. It'll be replenishing, flourishing, life-building activity instead of the drudgery and toil that work often assigns us in life here on earth. And so you have several passages that describe heaven in that way, such as Revelation chapter 7, verses 15 and following, which says, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple, and He who sits on the throne will shelter them with His presence. They will hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and He will guide them to the springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. They will serve Him, it says, day and night in the temple. And Revelation chapter 22, verse 3 says, no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and His servants will worship Him. Heaven will be a place of worship, which is an activity in itself. The only difference is that nothing will be burdensome, nothing will be tiring and toilsome. There won't be any work that you'll have to drag yourself into kicking and screaming, but you will be glad to do it, glad to serve the Lamb, glad to serve God the Father on His throne, because in heaven that's what activity will be all about. There will be no more crying. Death shall be no more. No more mourning, crying, or pain anymore. The former things, including all the work of this world, will have passed away. And that's something to look forward to in heaven. Whenever we rest It's important for our productivity. It's important for us to keep going, but it's also important to forecast eternal life with God in heaven one day. That's what we're all looking forward to. We're all headed for rest. In 1947, the explorer Thor Heyerdahl and 5 others drifted 4,300 miles in 103 days from the coasts of Peru to the Polynesian Islands. It was a harrowing trip across the Pacific, and in his book, Heyerdahl tells of observing a sign that they were approaching land. It was a flock of seabirds that began to circle around their vessel as they floated in that westerly direction. And the flock grew and grew and grew as the days wore on. And then at some point, near dusk on one day, they started flying single file in a westerly direction. And he realized they were flying for their nests on some island shore. And he commanded all of his men, put the oars in the water and begin rowing towards the birds, keeping their eyes focused on them because they were headed for rest. And they found land. They finally found land after 4,300 miles. Having endured the cross, Jesus has gone home to the Father. How can we get there? How can we find rest? Keeping our eyes on Him. We steer our course in His direction and follow Him all the way home. Heaven is rest in an eternal home, and we all want to help each other towards that rest. One of the ways we're doing that is singing this song of encouragement. And if you need any encouragement this morning to enter into your rest, let us help you. Let's do this together. Come right now as we stand together and as we sing.